They say ice is just water that has learned to survive the cold. And maybe that's what happens to the empath when the world finally becomes too loud to bear. They don't disappear, they crystallize. Carl Jung once wrote that the unconscious mind protects itself through transformation, not destruction. In his Zurich notes, he described a moment so disturbing that even he hesitated to publish it. A moment when compassion turned into clarity, and feeling too much became the beginning of psychological power. This is the story of what I call the cold empath, the one who stops apologizing for seeing too deeply, who no longer bleeds for everyone's chaos, and begins to understand that empathy without boundaries is self-betrayal. It's not a story about losing warmth. It's about shadow integration, the silent alchemy that turns emotional pain into precision. The same precision Jung identified as the heart of individuation, the process by which the self becomes whole. You might think the empath's breaking point is tragedy. Jung didn't. He called it revelation. Because beneath every emotional collapse lies an unconscious mind trying to complete a pattern, to evolve from reactive empathy into conscious awareness. To Jung, this wasn't madness. It was the psyche defending itself through awakening. And if you've ever felt that inner shift, the moment your sensitivity stopped feeling like weakness and started feeling like truth, you've touched that same current. It's the instant when emotional boundaries rise not out of bitterness, but wisdom. When you stop absorbing the world's pain and start observing it. When empathy, once drenched in sorrow, becomes crystalline, transparent, still, unshakable. The cold empath isn't numb. They are awake. Their silence isn't emptiness, it's information. It's the space where shadow work begins, where the empath stops rescuing and starts reflecting, where trauma and empathy stop colliding and start communicating. And in that frozen stillness lies something Jung feared and revered at the same time. A new form of consciousness, born from the collision between sensitivity and survival. You can call it individuation. You can call it healing. But Jung would say it's something more ancient. The moment the soul stops being a mirror for others and becomes a mirror for itself. Carl Jung wrote that every extreme emotion carries its own opposite hidden within it. Love becomes rage. Compassion becomes precision. Sensitivity becomes sight. In his clinical notes from Zurich, he described patients whose kindness had turned glacial, not from cruelty, but from clarity. These were empaths, individuals who had spent years absorbing everyone else's storms until one day, the warmth ran out. And what was left wasn't numbness. It was awareness sharpened into silence. In Jung's view, this wasn't collapse. It was compensation, the unconscious mind rebalancing itself after decades of overextension. He called it psychic counteraction, when the psyche restores equilibrium by awakening its opposite function. For empaths, that meant the birth of detachment, a coldness that wasn't absence, but protection. This marked what Jung later described as the integration of the shadow, the moment when the emotional self, once devoted to harmony, begins to acknowledge its buried intelligence. Jung noticed something extraordinary. When these empaths snapped, they didn't erupt in chaos. They froze. Their faces became calm, their voices slowed, their language precise. What looked like suppression was actually evolution, the unconscious reorganizing itself around survival. He observed that their intuitive capacity, the same sensitivity that once drew in pain, became analytical. They no longer just felt others, they understood them. In modern empath psychology, this moment represents a profound shift, the transition from reactive empathy to conscious empathy. It's the psychological moment when boundaries form naturally, not through defense, but through realization. The empath stops being an open circuit for the collective unconscious and becomes an interpreter of it. They start to see what Jung called the shadow patterns of others, projections, manipulations, emotional contagion. What used to wound them now becomes information. Jung documented this as one of the most disturbing revelations of human nature, because it reversed the moral equation. The kindest individuals were not weak, they were dormant observers. Once awakened, they became psychologically formidable. And what terrified Jung wasn't their power, it was their precision. They could sense deceit the way a musician senses dissonance, instantly, instinctively, without effort. He wrote that they had become psychologically complete, beings whose emotional intelligence had fused with analytical awareness. That transformation, he believed, was the mind's natural evolution under pressure, a form of individuation triggered by betrayal. When trust breaks, the unconscious mind reclaims what the persona has denied. The empath's warmth, once limitless, crystallizes into discernment. It is the soul's way of saying, I will not unsee what I've seen. And that's what Jung called the moment empathy turns cold. Not a death of feeling, but the beginning of seeing. A threshold where emotion becomes perception, and perception becomes power. The empath doesn't lose their heart. They simply stop giving it away to those who mistake compassion for permission. To Jung, every collapse of the psyche is not chaos, it's compensation. When an empath reaches their breaking point, it isn't the end of sensitivity, it's the unconscious mind forcing equilibrium. The psyche, after years of self-sacrifice, finally demands symmetry. And that symmetry often begins with silence. In empath psychology, this is the moment the nervous system stops absorbing others' emotions and starts decoding them. The empath's body, once an open gate for trauma and empathy, begins to close the door gently, not out of cruelty but out of self-preservation. What looks like emotional detachment is often the first sign of shadow work, the confrontation with everything the empath repressed in the name of kindness. Jung saw this as the psyche's self-correction, a natural reaction to emotional inflation. The unconscious, tired of being ignored, erupts not as noise but as stillness. Picture this. You're in the middle of an argument you didn't start, maybe with a partner, a co-worker, or a family member who has perfected the art of guilt. They raise their voice, twist your words, remind you of everything you've ever done wrong. In the past, you would have apologized, tried to fix what wasn't yours to fix, just to restore peace. But this time, something different happens. You stop. You hear every word, but not like before. You see the patterns, the manipulation, the projection. Your heart still feels, but it doesn't react. It observes. And in that stillness, there's power, the quiet, surgical precision of awareness. That's the snap Jung described, the moment empathy turns cold, not because it ran out of love, but because it finally understood what love isn't. It's the psyche reclaiming control from years of over-identification. It's not numbness, it's recalibration. Your brain stops running on emotional hypertunement and enters pattern recognition. You no longer drown in feelings, you map them. Every facial twitch, every shift in tone becomes data. The same intuition that once made you vulnerable now becomes analytical intelligence. It's not psychic power, it's pattern literacy, the ability to read the emotional field with surgical clarity. Jung believed this precision emerged from the integration of opposites, what he called enantiodromia, the tendency of every extreme to transform into its opposite. The empath's warmth births its own counterbalance, emotional frost. Not because love died, but because awareness matured. It is the archetypal alchemy of individuation, the merging of heart and mind, anima and animus, feeling and discernment. But there's danger in the cold. If the empath mistakes calm for superiority, the shadow reclaims control, turning observation into judgment. Yet, when awareness is guided by humility, the coldness becomes clarity, a tool for discernment, not distance. The empath learns that true emotional boundaries are not walls. They are membranes of consciousness. They filter what belongs to the self from what belongs to the collective unconscious. Through this process, what society calls emotional shutdown becomes something sacred, the individuation of empathy itself. It's the shift from unconscious absorption to conscious choice, the very transformation Jung saw as the cornerstone of psychological evolution. The empath stops existing as a reaction and begins existing as an observer. And in that still, cold awareness, a new form of inner power begins to rise, quiet, patient, incorruptible. For Jung, transformation was never about becoming someone new. It was about reclaiming what had always been there, buried beneath layers of fear and pleasing. He called this individuation, the process through which a fragmented soul retrieves its lost pieces and remembers itself. For the empath, this rebirth often begins in the quiet aftermath of the snap, when emotion gives way to perception, and perception turns into self-respect. It starts small. You no longer rush to explain yourself when misunderstood. You stop offering emotional CPR to people who keep choosing their own suffering. You begin to sense the subtle tremor of manipulation before it lands. And instead of reacting, you breathe. The silence that used to suffocate you now protects you. The boundaries that once felt like guilt now feel like home. That's how the integrated empath is born, not through rage, but through recognition. Not through closing off, but through calibration. Their warmth no longer leaks. It flows where it's deserved. Their compassion no longer bends. It stands upright. They have learned the sacred art of emotional economy, how to love without depletion, how to help without losing themselves. In Jungian terms, this is the reunion of opposites, the empath's heart finally in conversation with the mind. It's what Jung saw as the merging of feeling function with thinking function, creating an individual who no longer confuses empathy with self-erasure. The shadow is no longer the enemy, it becomes the guardian. The same inner voice once silenced by fear now whispers discernment. This person isn't safe. This dynamic isn't love. This silence is wisdom. In empath psychology, this marks the transition from emotional reactivity to conscious response. The empath's intuition, once unfiltered and raw, becomes disciplined. They start to navigate human emotion the way a musician reads notes, with both feeling and form. What once overwhelmed them now informs them. They sense the patterns of the collective unconscious, but no longer drown in it. And this integration doesn't make them cold, it makes them clear. They can still cry, still love, still care, but they do it from a place of sovereignty, not sacrifice. Their empathy now has structure. Their love, boundaries. Their silence, purpose. Imagine this moment. You're sitting across from someone who used to have power over you, maybe a parent who never saw you, an ex who thrived on control, or a boss who drained every ounce of your energy. They try the same tactics: guilt, gaslight, subtle disrespect. But this time, your nervous system doesn't collapse. Your chest doesn't tighten. You just see. You register the projection, the wound behind the words, the insecurity dressed as dominance. You see it, but you don't carry it. And that moment, that calm, almost sacred neutrality, is the living proof that healing has occurred. That's what Jung meant when he said the shadow becomes luminous when integrated. It's not that the empath becomes invincible. They become invisible to manipulation. They are no longer food for the emotional predators of the world. They stand at the center of their own psyche, neither rescuing nor retaliating, but observing. This is not detachment, it's mastery. The integrated empath walks through the world like still water, reflecting everything, absorbing nothing that isn't theirs. They don't shout their transformation, they embody it. They've stopped needing to be understood, because they understand. And that, Jung believed, is the truest sign of individuation, when your peace no longer depends on the chaos of others. The moment the empath becomes whole, silence changes its meaning. It's no longer absence, it's awareness. That calm neutrality, that almost divine stillness the integrated empath discovers, is what Jung considered one of the rarest psychological phenomena, the union of opposites. Because true healing isn't a return to light. It's learning to see within the dark without being devoured by it. In those moments of lucidity, when the empath no longer reacts, but observes, something extraordinary happens inside the unconscious mind. The parts that once fought for dominance, compassion and anger, trust and fear, reason and instinct, begin to negotiate. And from that negotiation emerges a new form of perception. Jung called it the transcendent function, the bridge between the conscious and the unconscious. To him, this was the very mechanism of individuation, the ability to hold contradiction without collapsing. That's why the empath's calm feels so unsettling to others. It carries the weight of both shadow and light in perfect balance. They can love you and see through you at the same time. They can forgive you without allowing you near. They can care without collapsing. And that's not coldness. That's clarity. Jung understood the shadow not as darkness to be destroyed, but as intelligence to be integrated. He wrote that the shadow, when embraced, becomes the seat of creativity. The very emotions the empath once feared, jealousy, rage, resentment, were never proof of impurity. They were data. Each negative feeling carried a message from the deeper self, signaling where energy had been stolen or denied. The empath who learns to listen instead of judge these messages gains not bitterness, but depth. Think of it like this. Every time you've said yes when you wanted to say no, the shadow remembered. Every time you sensed deceit but silenced your intuition, the shadow took notes. Every time you overgave, hoping someone would see your worth, the shadow whispered, "We are losing energy again." And one day, the day you stop overriding that whisper, you meet what Jung called the self, the integrated consciousness that includes both saint and serpent, nurturer and warrior. That's the birth of true inner power. Not dominance, not control, but equilibrium. The cold empath doesn't freeze because they lack emotion. They freeze because the psyche has stopped leaking energy into denial. Every part of them, even the shadow, now serves awareness. They no longer suppress their darkness. They converse with it. In shadow work, this dialogue becomes sacred. The empath begins to understand that the shadow is not their wound. It's their wisdom in camouflage. It's the mind's immune system, the place where repressed truth gathers strength until the conscious self is ready to handle it. And when that readiness comes, integration follows like dawn after a long night. The light doesn't chase away the dark. It collaborates with it. That's why Jung said, "One does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious." He wasn't talking about mysticism. He was describing what the empath eventually lives. The realization that to feel everything isn't a curse, it's a map. A navigation system built by the collective unconscious itself. It teaches discernment through contrast, compassion through confrontation, and wisdom through wounds. Picture this in everyday life. You walk into a room full of tension, maybe a meeting, a family dinner, a crowded subway. Before anyone speaks, you feel it, the static in the air, the undercurrent of unspoken words. But instead of absorbing it, you name it internally. Fear, insecurity, control. You don't take it on, you simply register it. That's not detachment, it's mastery of empathy. It's the shadow functioning as intuition, finally integrated with awareness. In that moment, the empath becomes what Jung might have called a psychological alchemist, turning unspoken emotion into insight, turning chaos into comprehension. That's the intelligence of the shadow. It doesn't erase what's human, it illuminates what's hidden. And that's why the integrated empath no longer feels like light or dark, good or bad. They feel real. and real, Jung wrote, is the rarest form of enlightenment. The world doesn't know what to do with an empath who no longer explains themselves. Because when you stop justifying your silence, it becomes sacred. And when you stop rescuing everyone from their own lessons, your presence becomes magnetic. This is where the empath's healing stops being theory and becomes embodiment. You start to notice it everywhere. At work, when someone tries to pull you into gossip or emotional chaos, you pause. The old reflex, to listen, to soothe, to fix, flickers for a moment, but doesn't take over. You observe instead. You see the insecurity beneath the aggression, the wound behind the performance. And instead of absorbing it, you let it pass through you. That's not indifference. That's empath psychology in practice, awareness without absorption. At home, you begin to notice the subtle shift. You no longer fight to be right. You stay to be real. You no longer beg to be understood. You speak once, calmly, and let silence do the translation. Sometimes that silence feels heavy. That's because silence carries data. Modern neuroscience shows that in the absence of noise, the brain begins to reorganize emotional information. A 2013 study published in Frontiers in Human Neuroscience found that 2 hours of silence per day led to measurable growth in the hippocampus, the region of the brain linked to memory and emotional regulation. In other words, silence doesn't mean nothing is happening. It means healing is. Jung would have loved this study. He believed the unconscious mind uses stillness to integrate what words cannot. What we call coldness is often the nervous system shifting from survival to synthesis. And science agrees. Recent research from the University of California, Irvine, 2022, shows that high empathy individuals process others' emotions through the same neural networks used for self-awareness, which means emotional overload is a neurological reality, not a weakness. Silence, then, isn't withdrawal, it's recalibration. Think about astronauts in orbit. They live in perpetual silence, surrounded by infinite space, disconnected from the noise of Earth. NASA psychologists have long noted how that silence forces inner awareness. In debriefings, astronauts describe a strange phenomenon called the overview effect, a cognitive shift where perspective expands and small concerns vanish. They stop reacting and start observing. That's the empath's silence too, not emptiness, but expansion. A psychological orbit around emotion, where you finally see patterns clearly instead of spinning inside them. The cold empath experiences something similar in daily life. When chaos erupts, at work, in family conflicts, or online, they don't lose themselves in it anymore. They become like those astronauts looking down at Earth, aware, calm, detached enough to see everything without judgment. And that distance doesn't disconnect them from humanity. It reconnects them to truth. That's what modern empath healing research confirms. Psychologists from Cambridge University, 2021, found that individuals with high empathy who also practice emotional regulation through mindfulness, silence, or boundary work show greater activation in the prefrontal cortex and lower amygdala reactivity. Translated, the more consciously you regulate empathy, the less your body interprets other people's pain as your own. The cold empath isn't suppressing emotion. They are integrating it at a higher neurological frequency. And the result? You start to move differently. You stop over-explaining. You listen without fusing. You empathize without dissolving. You can be surrounded by conflict and still remain internally quiet. It's not detachment. It's maturity of empathy, the union of compassion and cognition. It's what Jung called individuation, the transformation of feeling into understanding, and understanding into inner power. You can see this in any profession that operates in extremes: surgeons, pilots, firefighters, astronauts. They are not emotionless. They are trained to stay fully present while regulating response. That's why their silence feels powerful. And it's the same silence the empath learns after years of internal chaos. It's not cold. It's calibrated. Through this integration, even your energy changes. You start attracting people who don't need saving, only resonance. You begin communicating through presence, not persuasion. You set emotional boundaries without a single word. Your silence starts doing what your over-explaining never could, command respect. But this peace wasn't free. It was earned through shadow work, through learning that sometimes silence is the only language the unconscious understands. You've walked through empathy's extremes, from absorption to awareness, and come out fluent in both. Now, your stillness speaks in frequencies people can feel. And that, Jung might say, is the sound of conscious evolution. Maybe this was never about becoming stronger, just clearer. Because when the empath finally stops mistaking noise for connection, silence turns from absence into understanding. That's the moment Jung called integration, when you no longer seek to be heard, but to see. They say ice is just water that learned to survive the cold. And maybe that's what the empath becomes, not hardened, but crystallized, not detached, but distilled. Beneath all the pain and self-blame, there was never weakness, only unrefined sensitivity waiting to become wisdom. Jung wrote that the unconscious mind doesn't want peace, it wants evolution. And that's what happens when empathy learns discernment, when compassion develops boundaries, and feeling becomes clarity. The cold empath doesn't stop caring, they just stop carrying what isn't theirs. Their calm isn't apathy, it's coherence. Their stillness isn't emptiness, it's integration. You might notice it in daily life, in an argument you don't need to win, in manipulation that no longer hooks you, in peace that feels like self-respect. That's individuation, light not above darkness, but inside it. You haven't become cold, you've become clear. And clarity, Jung said, is consciousness waking up. So when people ask what happened to you, tell them, I didn't stop feeling. I started understanding. Because that's the true awakening, not the end of sensitivity, but its evolution. The moment when empathy stops dissolving and starts directing. When the soul, tired of chaos, freezes, not to die, but to see. If your silence has begun to speak louder than your words, comment below. I've learned to see. Because that's where the awakening begins. In the quiet brilliance of the hidden mind. Like water learning to survive the cold, you're learning to turn empathy into awareness. And in that awareness lies your power.